we're going to talk about installation and establishment in this section. And, you know, this is a good section to know. Sometimes things go wrong, as we just found out this morning, and you have to know what to do in those instances. So we're going to talk about how you properly plant and install the trees and actually get them to live. That's the best part of it. So let's get going. All right. So we're going to go over today the planting and transplanting techniques that are out there, the types of planting stock and planting methods, staking and guying of new trees, when's it needed, when's it not. We're going to discuss all that. Newly planted tree maintenance, and then we'll talk a little bit about transplanting palms. Let's see. So our plant selection, you're basically going to select your tree that is healthy and vigorous. I mean, why bring in a tree that is not in good health to start with? You really have to examine the entire tree at the nursery before you accept the tree. Or if they're coming on a truck and you haven't seen them yet, don't offload if you can until you've looked at those trees and the root balls. The root balls are really important, but obviously if the tops are dead when they get there, you don't want that material. Survival and new growth are dependent on water absorption capacity and stored carbohydrates. Remember, these trees are storing their carbohydrates in their limbs and branches, right, and little twigs, and they've got to be able to immediately start picking up water. So if there's not enough live root, your tree is doomed from the start. Okay, I don't care how many carbohydrates it has. If I can't pick up water, I'm not going to survive. The amount and condition of those roots greatly affects your transplant success. So basically, nursery stock type trees come in three types. You get bare root shipping, and nowadays they're usually covered in a gelatinous goo, which is a polymer base that keeps the roots moist. The other method that they send them in is the bags, and they're wax-coated paper bags, and they're kept really moist in there. They put in a good amount of water with it or soaking, and you have to get those in the ground really quick. The other method that comes in is a ball and burlap tree, which has been field dug usually. So these were growing either in a grow bag or a grow box in a field, and they've been cut out, dug, wrapped into a ball, and that's how they're transported. Okay. And then you have, of course, containerized trees, and the containers can be any shape or form. They can be made of plastic, rubber. I've seen them in aluminum. I've seen them in wood in boxes. So it just depends. They come in all types. But those are the three types of nursery stock. So let's talk a little bit about the bare root trees. Of course, they come without soil. They're really small and easy to transplant. That's one of their pluses. So if you're doing a large planting project, getting these, they're fairly cheap, and you can get a lot of trees in the ground pretty quickly. They're lightweight. They're planted during the dormant season before the roots and buds begin to grow. They should be kept moist. Like I said, they're usually wrapped in that stuff, or they're wrapped up in a airproof bag, or at least a moisture-resistant bag. They're cold stored. That's another way you can keep them. But even cold stored, they have to be kept moist. If the root tips die out, then you have a real big problem trying to get them to survive. As soon as you get those bare root trees, they should be planted immediately. You may need to soak them a little bit, 45 minutes to a half an hour, but really you should get them in the ground as soon as you get them, or the day after. This is kind of one of the methods that they look like when they get there. They're going to be either in a box or a bag and wrapped up tight, like this one in the picture on the right. On the left kind of shows you exactly how they come. I mean, especially the pine seedlings, they're going to have that little bushy top, and then they're going to have the root system, and that's it. There's not much to them, which makes it easy to plant again. So this is a little tip on planting bare root stock. Again, the trick is to soak them before planting. You can do it overnight, but not longer than 24 hours. Remember, after 24 hours, we die because of lack of oxygen. So got to keep those roots moist, but you don't want to kill them off. Then you're going to dig your hole, and you're going to build a mound up that you're going to actually set the roots of the tree on top of. You kind of spread them out so that they're not girdling and they're not curving. You just want to kind of make them straight onto that mound. And you're planting basically at the same depth or slightly above the level that the tree was grown in the nursery. You want to find that top root, and that should be about 1 inch at least down into the soil. And then you're going to backfill on top of that, tamp down. Now, when it says tamp, we're not talking about step on it with your foot, okay? Because then we're doing what? We're crushing those air spaces, right? So you're literally just going to tap it with your hands and then use the water to make that soil settle out, right? And then you add more soil on top of that if you need to. Excuse me. For small trees that are 8 feet tall or less, you usually don't need a support unless you're in an area of wind. And if you do end up having to use a support, make sure you don't leave it on more than, one growing season. A lot of folks won't even leave it on for that, but just don't forget it, because then you'll see that thing where it grows into the portable tree. So not good. So this is what it looks like. Perfect example of the spread roots over that compacted mound in the bottom of the planting hole, but keeping that top root close to the surface and ensure that your roots are not kinked and so they won't girdle. Okay. If you start a curving pattern, especially in clay soils, that is just going to continue. So this is really a kind of neat image. You can see the top root on the right. It's the thickest, highest root. That's your top root. So that's the one you want to make sure is no deeper than about 1 to 3 inches of soil. Okay. All right. So containerized or container grown trees are usually grown in a soil or a soil-less production medium, which is a substrate. The substrates usually consist of bark, compost, peat, perlite, and vermiculite. It's kind of a mix that they use in the nurseries. Always check the root systems on those containerized trees. If they're not being properly pruned each year as they're being transplanted up in pot size, you're going to have girdling roots. So you really have to check that root system. The nice thing about these is they can be planted pretty much any time of the year as long as they're properly watered and maintained. Okay, without water, and you're planting in the summer, you're going to have a tough time, especially in hot areas, hot climates. So water is critical. Check for girdling roots. Those are those roots or roots that can't be separated and teased apart. If they formed a root mass knot, you're going to have to cut that so that it breaks apart. And people think you're killing the tree when you're getting these things ready, but if you don't do it, they're going to kill themselves. You got to kind of think of it that way. So here's what it looks like when one comes out of a pot and it's got girdling roots. All right. So those roots have to be teased out with a root rake. They can be cut when they're really bad, like that first image where it's just wrapped around into a thick mat. A lot of times you end up just sawing off the first ½ inch or inch of these roots. It sounds brutal, but if you don't get that girdling stopped, like I said, that pattern is just going to continue. And if you look at the image on the right, you'll notice even once you get the outer roots teased out, you may find girdling roots that are larger from the original pot size it was planted in that were never cut. So those are going to have to be addressed too. This is what I was talking about. The containers can look like anything. Excuse me. Boxes, you name it. They come in all shapes and sizes. Now, when you're picking your quality on these container trees, you want to look for good quality versus poor quality. All right, so if you look at the image on the left with the guy, wow, that is a really, really big trunk in a very, very small pot. And it doesn't look like you've got good branch development up at the crown, right? You've got more trunk than you have live crown ratio, and you definitely have more live crown ratio than you have root ratio in that pot. So that might not be a tree you want to select at the nursery. However, the one on the right, although it looks a little bushy, it is a holly variety, and they tend to do that. That one would be a definitely better choice than the one on the left, right? Okay. So when you're planting containers, you have to dig the hole first, cut the sides of the container to open it, and gently remove that root ball. You don't want to grab it by the trunk and yank it out of the pot. That can actually break the root collar, the connection to the root stem of the root mass, and then the tree's going to die anyway. So you want to just kind of take the pot off of it or shake it out of the pot. I've had people roll it, but to cut the container is usually the easiest way to get it out of there, especially if it's root bound. In step 2, you're going to kind of lay the root ball on its side, and that's when you're going to cut any circling roots, tease out the roots, loosen up the soil with a claw, and leaving the rest of that root intact and making sure you cut the girdling roots. Then you're going to slide it on down into the hole. You're going to make sure that your hole's the right depth. We'll get into that in a minute. Backfill it with topsoil again, let it soak, water thoroughly, add a little bit more topsoil after it settles, and then you want to put some mulch on it. About 2 to 3 inches of organic mulch is best. keeping it at least 4 to 6 inches away from the trunk flare. And then you're going to water that tree every week. And please remember to take the pot off the tree. I don't care that you put in a root block barrier to keep the roots from spreading out made of metal. It's not going to go anywhere because you've left the pot on. You know, we can't make this stuff up, but this stuff actually happens. Yeah, so enough said. All right, balled and burlap, B&B, as we call it in the field. Up to 90% of the roots may be lost during the digging of that B&B tree, right? They're cutting off those smaller root systems as they're digging that ball. They come with the root ball covered in a burlap, and then it's placed in a wire basket. On really large balls, root balls, they place drum lacing with ropes around that for additional support. So that's what drum laced is. It's using rope for additional support on large B&B trees. You have to remove that burlap covering at the top and sides of the root ball. If you can get it all off there, that's the best, okay? But at least get it off the top and sides. Remove all your twine, your rope, your straps, your tags, your labels, your flagging. Why is it important to remove all those straps? Why can't you just leave those in the ground? Well, if they're up near the top of the soil, they'll act as a wick. I don't care how much water you put in there, that rope is going to act just like a wick and draw that moisture right out of the ground and up into the air. So it's really important to cut those straps off. Cut away the upper 1/3 of that metal basket to 1/2. Or if you can get as much as possible, that's really the best. You can just take wire snips and cut it as low as you can in that hole and get most of it off if you can. This is what they look like when they come in. This has been burlap covered in twine wrapped, and that's kind of what they look like. When it's like this, again, remember, you're not going to be able to pick that thing up from the trunk. You're going to break the root connection. So you really want to just roll it onto its side and then roll it over to the planting hole. Hopefully, they're not too far from the planting hole and be able to roll it right over there. But keep that in mind because these things are not lightweight. They are heavy. It's going to take those 2 big dudes to move that tree, you know, maybe 3, depending on how much dirt's trapped in that ball. So the size of the root ball is based on the tree's caliper size, right? You need to refer to the American Standards for Nursery Stock publication for the proper size relationships. So that can be found in ANSI Z60.1. That's where you're going to find nursery stock proper size relationships. ANSI Z60.1. Remember, where we repeat stuff or you see it repeated in here, you're going to want to make note of that. Put a pair later to remind you. Caliper is measured at 6 inches above the ground line for trees that are less than 4 inches diameter, and then 12 inches for trees that are more than 4 inches in diameter. So 2 different measurements. Caliper, right, is measuring at 6 inches above the ground line for trees that are smaller than 4-inch diameter, right? And diameter is usually measured at breast height. So hope that gives you an indication. And then 12 inches or more for trees that are 4 inches in diameter, right? So that they're more than 4 inches. The width of the root ball equals about 10 to 12 inches of diameter. So it's like 10 to 12 inches in diameter per 1 inch of trunk caliper, okay? That's kind of the math. That's how wide your root ball should be. So you get a good indication if you keep that rule of thumb in there, 10 to 12 inches in diameter on the trunk of the tree, and you should have per 1 inch of trunk caliper. So your width of the root ball should be determined by how many inches of trunk caliper. I hope I got that to you right. Got to have enough roots. Keep that in mind. Transplanting. You can transplant a tree, but it involves digging and preparation for moving. You have to have the hole pre-dug, right? Trees that are hardened off are allowed to become acclimated to the cold or to a new environment. And the best time to transplant trees is in early spring, and I mean early spring, or late fall. So early spring or fall. And like I said, on the transplants, you really want to have the hole dug before you get that tree out of the ground and move it. This is what it looks like when they're hardening off trees. You may have seen these sitting around on nursery lots or on a site where they're getting ready to be moved in. Hardening off is a term used to refer to the process necessary for a plant to become acclimated to its environment. right? So in the fall, trees begin to harden off or acclimate themselves to a harsh winter condition, beginning with lower temperatures and shorter days. So deciduous trees and shrubs shed their leaves and transfer sap at that point into the root system. B&B trees are often dug in fall and then hardened off over winter. They keep that root ball mulched and irrigated. Usually you'll see mulch laid over the top of these to keep them from drying out, and they may have a sprinkler system set up for them. So the time of planting, the best time to plant trees is during their dormant season, right? When they're dormant, they have a lower metabolic rate, they have a low transpiration rate, so they're not going to be losing as much water. They have a low temperature. It is a less demand on soil moisture because they're not transpiring so much, right? And you get less transplant shock from root loss if you do it when the tree is dormant, okay? So keep that in mind. Only transplant these trees or plant trees during that dormant season. Ooh, now digging. Like I said, when you're doing the transplants, it removes up to 95% of the root system. Dormant season is recommended, again, for that type of stuff, fall to early spring. A root pruning before digging increases the root ball development in the ball. So if you make a clean cut before you actually dig the root ball, those roots have a chance to harden off, right? Compartmentalize, and then they shoot out new shoots, left, right, up or down, right? So you're taking what was a longer root and actually making it short and come out to the side. So it helps add those roots it's going to need to come and pick up more water once you put it in, helps it survive the transplant shock a little bit better. And then they also tie up the branches before moving to keep them from breaking. This is an exceptionally large tree that they're transplanting. You don't see this done too often, but it can be done. It takes a lot of prep and a lot of work to get these big ones to survive. All right, so this is what it looks like when they transplant with what's known as a tree spade. There are different size tree spades. There are some that are mounted on large trucks, like this D90 in the lower right, and on the upper right, it's attached to a huge tractor. And then you have the smaller ones that can be put on like a skid steer or a bobcat. And basically, they all work the same way. You have those 4 blades. They go into the ground, they open up, and then they go into the ground like a giant spade. They are very sharp, and they literally cut out the dirt. They move the dirt to the hole. They take it with them, so they kind of cut out the shape that they're going to plant the tree in. Then they go to where they're picking up the tree. They drop the dirt. They put the spade around the tree. Each one of those blades goes into the ground, severs the roots, lifts the tree all in one motion, and then lowers it onto the back of the truck or up into the air to be moved. After they go and move the tree, then their workers usually can go and take the dirt that they pulled out of the other place and put it into the hole. The nice thing about transplanting with tree spades is once the trees are put into the ground in the hole you already dug, it looks like they grew there. I mean, you'd never know once the mulch is in and they're settled. And usually the root balls are so heavy, they don't usually tend to stake these up unless it's in a really windy area. And even then, I think I would rather do like a root ball staking than I would tying and guying. So it's a really neat method, and it can be used a lot to save larger trees, like, between 2 inches, and I've seen them go all the way up to 18 with red maples, 18 inches diameter, and they do survive. So it's a nice way to keep larger material, even if you have to move it from one location to the next on the site. You're keeping that growth that it would cost you a lot of money to get from a nursery. So tree transplanting and establishment. Again, this is kind of the 10 steps to properly planting a tree. You can kind of go over that. You want to prune off the codominant leaders. Do not prune the terminal leader or branch tip. That would be a bad idea because then your tree's never going to look right, or it's never going to grow if you hit that terminal branch. You can prune off rubbing and crossing branches, dead branches, trees that branches are going to have a weird angle and really compromise the main trunk. Other than that, I really wouldn't do a lot of pruning on these trees. In fact, I probably wouldn't do much pruning until it's been in the ground at least a year or 2, right? But getting it in, if you notice right away you have a dead limb or a broken branch, you can go ahead and prune those off. Definitely remove the tags because those will just become grown into the tree, which is not a good thing. cut away all that baling rope, remove the top of the wire basket, widen and score the sides of the hole, especially in clay soils. What happens if you cut with a shovel or spade in a clay soil? You actually glaze the edge of that cut, and so it becomes like a pot. So you really want to break that up in clay soils, okay? Make sure you get all the girdling roots off, prune off any suckers that are coming out from the bottom, settle your tree, add your soil. Again, don't step on it with your foot and kill all the airspace. And always dig your hole 2 to 3 times the width of that root ball. It's not that the trees have to be deep, but they have to be wide. Remember, that root system is going to spread out from the trunk, right where they're sitting. So they're not going to dive down into the ground if it's in a hardened pan anyway. So the soil is tough and hard. The roots aren't going to look to go down, right? If you're in an area where you got tons and tons of topsoil, yeah, they may go down. But for the most part, they're going to go out and not down. So you really want to break out the area around the hole, okay? Here's a typical planting detail that is shown on plans most of the time. This one is calling for staking. And when you're doing the reviews on these kind of things, I usually put a note on there when that staking is supposed to be removed. Otherwise, they won't pay attention to it. You can highlight it too. But that's what a detail looks like. Again, those 10 steps for proper planting, another 10. You want to look up for wires and lights. Remember where you plant, right tree, right place. Yeah. Dig shallow, wide holes. Find the topmost root and treat root defects. Place the tree in the hole. Position the top root 1 to 3 inches within the top of the soil. Straighten the tree. If you plant it crooked, it's not going to grow straight, right? So you got to look at it from 2 different angles. Make sure the tree is in the ground straight. And again, you can't just grab the trunk and shift the whole thing. You're going to snap the root connection. So you've got to take that shovel like this guy's doing over here on the picture on the right, and you're going to have to move the tree by shoving the shovel under there and kind of lifting it up and wiggling it around. It's not easy. So it's really critical you get that right before you drop it in the hole, right? Add backfill soil from the root ball. Keep the mulch away from the trunk at least 4 inches. Stake and prune if needed, okay? Again, look up. This is your last chance to make sure you've put the right tree in the right place. We don't want to create these wire-eating monsters, right? If there's a wire security light nearby a building it's not going to be able to grow into, plant it somewhere else, or pick a smaller maturing tree or one with a columnar top that's going to fit that space, okay? Look around. Remember, trees don't just grow up, they grow out. So take into consideration any adjacent impacts that the tree is going to have as it gets older. Parking lot perimeters are always a challenge, right? They've got guard posts, they've got fence posts, they've got chain link, and as you can see, this tree on the bottom right is happily munching away on a pole for a fence. It's planted too close. The fire hydrant, well, it's going to be secure. I don't think anybody will ever steal it, but yeah, that's a problem all on its own, right? So those trees are going to continue to move out. Make sure you look where you're planting. All right, so measure the distance between the topmost root, right, and the bottom of the root ball. You can use a stick to measure it. You can even use your shovel if you don't have a stick out there. You can use your shovel to measure it, right? Dig the hole at about 90 to 95% of that depth, right? That way, you're not going to get your root ball too deep. And that is not a good thing when the root ball is too deep, okay? So there's how you find your topmost root. Remember, we talked about that. It's the point where the topmost root meets the trunk of the tree, and it should be no more than 1 to 3 inches deep in the root ball when planted, okay? You may find that nursery added about 6 to 8 inches of soil over the top of that when they were folding up the bag. You really have to clear all that off, okay? Get it to about 1 to 3 inches in the root ball, and when it's planted, that's where it should be too. Here we're talking about root ball quality. All right, you can see on the right, you've got excess soil over the top of the root ball. It's not got good development. It's barely got any feeder roots, right, or advantageous roots that are going to get out there and get watered. One on the left is a good looking root ball, right? It's got the topmost root near the surface of the root ball, and it has a more defined root system. So really take a look at them before you put them in the ground. And this is critical. I mean, all that dirt you see on the left beside this pot was over the top of the topmost root. So that's 3 inches of planting soil that they had to take off of it before they could put it in the ground. You know, you can blend that stuff back into the planting hole, but there again, you don't want too much stuff over the top of it because it's just going to create and trap moisture against the trunk, and then you get rot, fungus, and all kinds of stuff. All right, remember we talked about girdling roots. Allowing that stem girdling roots remain on the new plants will cause major problems for the tree as it grows. It just continues to choke itself out, right? And eventually, sorry about that, the tree will succumb and fall over and become Quercus horizontali again. You know, it's an oak tree on the ground. And you can see in this image on the right, it's just perfect. You know, you can see the perfect ring that this tree actually choked itself out with and then fell over because there was nothing to hold it upright, right? Can't say it enough, cut those girdling roots. So treating root defects, you know, cut, spread out any circling or kinked roots growing above the topmost root. All right, if it's circled the pot and come back up into that extra soil, that's really a problem. So you want to make sure you cut those girdling roots, okay? The defects at the top of the root ball, remove planting medium from the top of the root ball and cut those circling crossed roots, all right? And this is just an area showing those 2 dots where the arrow is pointing to. That's where you could cut that root that's actually circling the tree. And it will compartmentalize. So, but you want to cut that off before it gets going on that. Okay, so here's, again, those circling roots. You think they want you to know this? Yeah, we're covering this a lot, huh? Cut them, tear them up, tear out the edge of the root ball to spread those roots out, right? New roots will quickly grow into the backfill soil following that pruning, but stem girdling roots are less likely to form if you go ahead and cut them or tease them out. And it looks horrible. It looks like you're killing the plant, but you really aren't. You're helping it. It may not go as quickly as one that you didn't do this to, but in 3 to 5 years, the one that that had the girdling roots will probably be dying, and the one that you did this to will be twice the size. So they go into a little bit of shock, but you're saving the plant. Okay, so this one looks good. It's all teased out, but when you look close in there, you'll see that where the trees were in that smaller container, you have a whole nother layer of girdling roots. You've got to cut that because, again, that's just going to continue that pattern. So it really takes some work to get in there, keep these roots wet, keep them, you know, keep a water hose running by it, keep bottles of water, jugs of water if you're in the field, where you can, or a mister so you can spray them, keep them moist while you're doing this work. But get rid of those defects inside the root ball. All right, so this is what happens when you go ahead and plant one with circling roots and don't cut them. They can often be found leaning after a strong wind event because, again, that circling root is not giving strength to the tree. Remember, that spider web needs to go out into the soil in all different directions to provide that tension strength, right? So when you've got a circling root, that doesn't happen. It's literally going around and you're not getting the strength to be able to hold itself up. So whenever you get ones like this in the field that you found after a planting event, you know, your best bet is to get it uncovered and see what's there. If it's girdling, cut it, get the tree staked up so that it can survive the wind until those roots get out and form. Okay. Again, lifting the tree to avoid damage when setting the tree in the hole. Lift with the tree straps and the rope around the ball, not by the trunk. Okay. Put the tree in the hole. Pretty simple, right? Check your depth. This guy's using a soil shovel, like we talked about, to check his depth. Most tree planting professionals agree it's better to plant the tree a little high than too deep. All right. We would all rather have it a little bit high in the soil than too deep in the soil. When the topmost root is too deep in the root ball, set the top of the ball several inches higher than the landscape soil to adjust it as shown above, right? So that's what he's showing you. Where his topmost root is, he needs to make sure that one's right there in the soil, right? So like I said, it'd be hard to find the topmost root in this ball unless you unwrap it, okay? So once you get it set there, you're definitely going to want to look for that, clear it off, all that stuff. But if you're in a clay soil, you're going to want to set it shallow, and it looks like it's too high, but you're building the berm up around that with the soils around it, and the tree will actually do better in a clay soil set that high. All right, so this is obviously too deep. Somebody did not check their stuff before they put it in, right? So it's about 5 inches too deep in the soil. Now you have a problem. You're going to have to add soil to the bottom of the hole. And you're going to have to use those shovels to dig it out, right? And move it around. It's not easy. So try and avoid this one on the right. You want it to look like the one on the left. Okay, the effects of planting depth on stress after planting. The primary position primary roots 1 to 3 inches below grade, 1 to 3 inches, right? Excess soil over the root ball intercepts water meant for the roots and causes them to dry out. So you don't want a bunch of soil over the top of the root ball. Mulch and soil against the trunk is a problem. Too much mulch on the root ball is a problem. Planting too deep is a problem. And leaving the wire basket, string, and burlap is a problem, okay? Straighten that tree. Like I said, before you add the backfill, be sure to check this tree straight. You got to look at it from 2 perpendicular directions, because it may look perfectly straight this way, but if you go around to the side, you'll see that it's actually leaning, right? So 2 different directions. Make sure your tree's straight. Burlap should be removed from the bottom of the trunk, the top of the root ball, and as far down as possible, with the remainder pushed to the bottom of the planting hole. If you can cut all of it off, great, cut all of it off. But if not, shove it as far down in that hole as you can get it. Synthetic burlap, you can tell the difference between synthetic burlap and real burlap, because if you hold a lighter to synthetic, it kind of melts into a plastic goo. And real burlap actually flames and turns to ash when it's lit, okay? If your burlap's synthetic, you really have to make sure you remove all of it with a pruner, knife, or other sharp blade. There's a reason for that. This is the reason. Roots can grow through artificial burlap with little difficulty, but as they attempt to expand in diameter, they become girdled or strangled by that material. And each of those roots is really easy to break off at the burlap because there's very little wood developed through the burlap, right? So you got root through there, but it didn't really get the good firm hard covering. So it's really not a good thing. That they can do it doesn't make it a good option. It's best to take the burlap off, okay? Again, with the wire basket, same thing, right? Baskets made from heavy gauge wire are used to help to keep that root ball intact only for shipping and handling. So you got to get as much of the wire off of that as possible. Otherwise, it becomes included into that root system. And it can make it weak. It can do all kinds of stuff. So you definitely want to try and get that off. There you go, adding your backfill. You can shovel it in there, just kind of tamp it. Don't step on it like guys I've seen guys do. Then you're crushing all the beautiful airspace you created. Cut into the backfill is a better way to do it. Come outside and dig a new ring outside the ring that you just dug to make the hole, and use your shovel to kind of push that soil against the root ball, right? You're saving yourself a little work and a little shoveling using that fulcrum. So it's just an easy way to do it. And it also breaks up the hole further out, right? So it makes it easier for the tree to move out into that soil. Moderately pack it with your hands, not your feet, right? Kind of tamp it. Then water it in. When you water it, that's going to settle the soil, right? And you'll see if you need to add a little bit more soil back in there. If not, you're good. Now, people always ask about, should I fertilize my new tree? Well, it's really not recommended, okay? Fertilizing at planting time is not likely to improve survival or growth. It may add a small benefit if you're in really poor soils. I mean, nitrogen can stimulate root growth with proper watering. Soluble fertilizers can actually burn roots if too much is applied, and that would injure and kill the tree. So if you have to use a fertilizer at all, use only slow release fertilizers, okay? You really don't want to use anything else. As far as mulch, you definitely want to use mulch. Okay, apply 2 to 4 inches of organic mulch, at least 6 feet in diameter, around a 1 to 2 inch caliper tree. Wider with mulch is better than deeper, right? Problem with deep mulch, the water can't get through it. You'll get a good soaking rain. Get out there, if they put 4 inches or 5 inches of mulch on top of a tree, dig it away, and you'll see that the water hasn't gotten all the way through the mulch. Your poor tree roots are still dry. That's why it's kind of critical, no more than 4 inches. So, okay, and let's see, don't use that black plastic underneath the mulch. It's not going to help out any. The mulch is going to smother weeds and stuff all by itself. Do not allow mulch to build up against the trunk, as that will trap water and moisture against the trunk and create problems, pathogens, pests, mold, fungus, all that kind of stuff. Just don't do it. Improper mulching. Well, if turf grass grows up to the trunk of trees, they don't perform well, okay? The grass is getting everything the tree needs, and the poor trees underneath the grass roots trying to get some water and nutrient, right? It robs trees of moisture, nutrients. Some produce chemicals that inhibit the tree growth. Lawn mowing equipment then has to come in, and with the weed eaters, you know, they just cut the tree trunk, which really does the tree in too. So mulching is good, but make sure you mulch properly. Here's a look at the awful never-ending pile mulch volcano. They're horrible. Like I said, they trap rot. They cut off oxygen to the roots. They trap moisture against the tree, causing rot. They keep vital irrigation and rainwater out, so the roots are either too wet in poorly drained soils or too dry in dry soils because the water can't make it through the mulch. You can also create stem girdling roots that way because the roots are trying to come up to get air or water, and they start circling in that mulch area. So just not a good thing. Don't do mulch volcanoes. Staking and guying, like we said, support is not always necessary. You really only want to use this if the tree needs it. If it falls down once you get it planted, you'll find that rarely happens. It can be detrimental to the root tree development. You get a smaller root system, you get less paper, the tree doesn't learn to flex and bend in the wind like it needs to and put out response growth, right? So you really don't want to leave that poor tree tied up. You only want to use it on windy sites or for large conifers, maybe bare root trees, or somewhere where you think vandalism or mechanical damage may occur, or where trees are being planted on a steep slope. Then they may need some help to get established. The trees can become injured or girdled from the staking and guying materials. Also, if it's improperly installed or not removed in a timely manner, or if it's removed improperly, you can hurt the trunk too, especially on thin bark trees. You can really tear the bark and then we have a problem, right? So here's a good reason why you take the staking and guying off. Yes, class, this is staking and guying tubes that were left on a poor little tree and it encapsulated it. You know, there sits my 3 little tubes that I use to stake and guy the tree. Not a good thing. Here are the traditional staking methods that are used, and all of these systems, whatever one you used, you really need to take off within a year of planting. Okay? Got to take those things off within a year of planting. You can use the flexible rubber material and stakes in the ground, or you can do the stakes the opposite way like it does in the middle picture, or you can do the 2 wood stakes and then going across to the root ball. All of those work well, but all of them have to be taken off. Use 1 to 3 stakes. Guying material should be wide, smooth, non-abrasive. If you put an abrasive piece of cordage or plastic or whatever onto the tree trunk, as the tree moves in the wind, it just scrapes that bark right off, right? So don't use anything that's got that abrasive stuff on it. They should be flexible and they should be photodegradable, which means it's going to break down in the sunlight. So if somebody forgets to take it off, the tree at least has a chance, right? Stakes should be placed on the upwind side of the tree. That allow movement of the tree. You don't want to strap it down so that it can't move. It needs to be able to move and respond. And remember, this is only temporary. Remove within a year of planting. Guying, you use wire for larger trees over 4 inches diameter at breast height. Use 3 to 4 guy wires or straps around the tree. You can secure the guy wires and straps into the ground with anchors, stakes, land anchors, or dead men. Those are all methods that they use. Place the anchors in the ground toward the tree. Guying with the wire thread through rubber hoses is not recommended, because you saw what happened with those rubber hoses right through the middle of the tree, right? And again, remove after 1 year of planting. The tree doesn't need it anymore. Tree wraps and guards are really not recommended for new trees. The wraps create larger temperature fluctuations. They hold moisture against the trunk. They provide a shelter for insects. Down here in our region of the Piedmont, you put those guards on and you've just created a perfect nesting habitat for those little pincher bugs. They're terrible. So yeah, don't do it. Plastic or metal mesh guards installed around trunks to help minimize damage by animals and mowers and trimmers. That works a little better, and they really shouldn't sit right up against the trunk. They should be off the trunk by at least an inch or two. Okay, just keep that in mind. Pruning, let's see. Pruning after planting should be limited. Remove broken branches, like I said. Perform structural training pruning early in the tree's life, between years 1 to 3 after planting, to establish a central leader, well-spaced and well-balanced branches that are well attached. That's really all you're looking for. And don't prune to compensate for root loss. This is something they used to do in the old days. If they cut off so much of the roots, then they would cut off so much of the top. But they realized through the science that no, the trees need those extra carbohydrates and stuff that are stored in those branches. So don't prune to compensate for root loss, okay? Planting specifications. Well, detailed plans is what planting specifications are. They're statements of procedures and standards for planting trees or shrubs in the landscape, okay? It's a written work before the work is bid out. So you're writing up what you're going to do before you bid it out. Define your key terms. Clearly define a healthy or vigorous tree, because what's healthy to you may not be healthy to somebody else. So you want to know, what does a healthy tree mean? Establish timelines for each step in the installation. It's going to be done from this time to this time, right? By this time, we'll do that. Include follow-up maintenance like watering. Watering is critical, right? And inspections after big storms, or once or twice a year, every 2 years, once every 2 years, once a year. Set up your inspection schedule. Define the length and terms of any warranty that you're going to supply, right? And always utilize your American Standard for Nursery Stock, or ANSI, Z60.1 for tree quality, right? It's already written up. Use what's there. Then we're all on the same page, and there's protection in that, right? So what's the American Standard for Nursery Stock? ANSI Z60.1, okay? Good. Any questions? That's the end of that.
Okay, so we're going to jump into pruning. This is chapter 8. Hopefully, here we go. All right, so I've mentioned before about these ANSI A300 specifications. It would be a good idea to read through part 1 of these ANSI standards. They are currently being updated, as we spoke about before, and it's now going to become a unified document instead of becoming these 10 or 13 parts, 14 parts, ever how many it has now. But it'd be a good idea to go ahead and order these, especially as it pertains to pruning, because some of the vocabulary has changed. So we're going to be talking about the objectives of pruning. Why do you want to prune? What are you trying to accomplish when it comes to trees, shrubs, and palm trees? We're going to compare and contrast a little bit these different pruning methodologies. We're going to learn how to identify structures associated with the branch attachment, including the function of the branch protection zone. Recognize the types of pruning cuts and how to use them to meet your pruning objectives that you've established. And what effects are going to be produced from the pruning, what response and recovery, and how these are impacted by timing and the severity of the pruning. And then we'll also talk specifically about palm pruning and how it differs from pruning shrubs and trees. As you recall, they do not compartmentalize. They also store energy reserves in a slightly different method from xylem producing trees, or xylem retaining trees, I guess I should say. So pruning is the most common tree maintenance procedure. So we have removals, we have pruning, and then we have plant health care. So by far and away, pruning is the most common maintenance procedure that is done to a tree. Typically, it's done to maintain safety, improve the structure and health, satisfy the customer's goals, and improve aesthetics. Again, I never think that one tree says to another tree, hey, you're a pretty good looking tree. I wish I could look that good. So really aesthetics is we've anthropomorphized trees a little bit, and it's like, okay, we think they have some sort of human aspect to them that gives them a special beauty to each other, but really it's just a human thing as to the way we perceive the way that they look. And we'll talk a little about that. Arborists need to understand the biology and the basic requirements of trees to prune for optimal tree health, safety, and structure. So what are your objectives for pruning? Is it going to be foliage removal? Is it going to be to lessen the inherent risk associated with a tree? Are you trying to gain some sort of specific view of the tree? Keep in mind, though, that removing foliage from a tree by pruning branches, you are removing stored starch reserves. Remember how we talked about all those starches get stored in the older xylem tissue. So if you're pruning a live canopy off of a tree, and what supports the live leaves is going to be the woody structure of the tree that's going to hold those leaves out there. So whenever you prune off the woody branches that are alive, you are pruning off stored starches. So you're decreasing the amount of stored reserves there that the tree can call upon in times of need. And taking off that woody material, you're also taking off the leaves, and that is the photosynthetic producing portion of the canopy. Remember, all photosynthate is produced in the leaves, and it's going to move downstream. So by pruning that off, you are lessening the amount that can be generated by the tree. Earlier you heard Kay talking about tree installation, and you really don't want to prune a lot of the canopy live growth off of a tree, just the broken and dead parts off of it when you're planting it. And that's because it needs absolutely as much energy as it can manufacture in order to put out a new root system. So trees have a certain genetic capacity to produce energy, and they enjoy having that amount. So when you start pruning on the tree, you are going to get some type of response from the tree. Just keep that in mind. Growth after pruning is going to take place on a smaller tree. So if you prune 20% of the length off of a branch, everything that comes about that following year is going to have to take place on a smaller structure. So you used to have all of this out here, and now you don't. So you're literally making a smaller plant every time you prune it. And you can also invigorate some shoot growth on these remaining parts. So when you prune off those limiting auxins, you could force some epicormic growth further down the branch structure. And that's going to take place on a smaller area. So we have the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, A300 Part 1. These are the standards for tree pruning, and they've also been incorporated into the ISA Best Management Practices, referred to as tree pruning. Let's talk about these objectives now. Establish clear and a very clear objective for pruning before you begin. Don't just jump into it. Put some thought into it. Are you trying to reduce the tree to make it a little smaller, or are you trying to prevent branch failure? Are you trying to change that potential? Maybe you have a really long branch that was seeking sunlight and it was surrounded by some other trees that have died, or you remove those other trees and now you have this sort of unprotected, very long branch that's prone to failure. So you might want to reduce the length of that branch a little, 10, 15%, something like that, to help establish a greater amount of taper. And we'll talk about taper a little bit further into this and in the risk management section. But that might be a reason to do that. Provide clearance. Do you have, this low branch covering up a stop sign, and you've created risk in the environment by blocking the stop sign, and maybe cars won't see it and they'll just blow right through an intersection. So Or do you have a parks tree and your typical mower is at a certain height and the bottom permanent branch structure of the tree as it is too low, and maybe it'll hit the safety mechanisms on the tractor that's mowing it. And so you might want to elevate the or provide more clearance of that lower canopy so that you can get under it. Are you trying to reduce shade and wind resistance? You're trying to get more grass to grow under the tree. Never a good idea, but everyone wants to do that. So are you trying to reduce that amount of shade? And there's also this thought out there that if you prune the canopy enough, you're going to get more wind penetration through the canopy, and you will. Wind will blow through it more, but does it really change how that tree responds in a storm environment? And that's still kind of up for debate. Are you pruning to maintain health? When might you do this? Ask yourself that. So you have fire blight, or you have a canker on one branch. By pruning that off, you're going to maintain the health of the plant, or even you could improve it. Maybe you have mistletoe growing in the tree and it's put down roots, but it's just a very small portion of the canopy. So you can go up there and literally prune all those roots out and get rid of the mistletoe altogether. Maybe you have an orchard and you're trying to influence flower or fruit production, or you're trying to change the structure of the tree to support heavy fruit, things like that. Are you trying to improve the view? Maybe you have a mountain cabin and there's one tree that's in front of your patio that's keeping you from seeing the great vista behind the tree. So is there a way to prune the tree where you're improving the view, using it to your benefit? And lastly, this improved aesthetics. Again, this is a human thing, and it's different from every human. So just because an arborist might say, well, this looks better if we were to do this, is not the same thing as the tree steward or the owner saying, it looks lopsided to me. I want you to take off a bunch off of this side so it looks bad. So it'll be balanced and it'll stand up straight. Everyone has these ideas of aesthetics. So when you're pruning for your client, it's important to have an understanding of what they believe aesthetics, or how you're going to improve a tree's aesthetics. Consider tree growth and development and the effects of pruning over the long term. Remember, trees can live hundreds of years, much longer than the arborist that's pruning the tree. And so when someone engages you in a contract to prune the tree, you're taking on a really great responsibility to not harm that tree, and to be doing some benefit by pruning that tree, and pruning it in such a way that you'll minimize the amount of decay in the future, so that 200 years from now, an arborist can come back and help maintain these trees. It's not just a whim. Put a lot of consideration into how this is done. So now we're going to talk about branch attachment, some tree biology, compartmentalization, and what role that plays in pruning. So remember, every time you prune something that's live, you are creating an injury in the tree. And that injury, we want to minimize it. We want to minimize the risk of decay. We want to minimize the risk of pests and pathogens getting into the pruning wound, things like that. So we need to understand the role that compartmentalization plays. And to help understand that a little further, we talked about in the biology section, we talked about branch collars and branch protection zones, branch bark ridges, and all that sort of stuff. So we're going to pull that back in and use it again in this section. So the branch collar forms when a branch remains relatively small in diameter compared to the main stem. So you've got this big trunk over here, and you've got this little branch that comes off of the main trunk. So you have those overlapping tissues there that get you that little swollen area, which forms the branch collar. So knowing that we're going to prune at the branch collar means that we're only going to be pruning off limb wood. We're not going to be pruning off trunk wood. We'll examine that a little closer, but understanding where that branch collar is will help you to minimize decay and use compartmentalization to your benefit. Overlapping wood is strong and forms a unique barrier called the branch protection zone. So this branch protection zone extends in from the branch collar, extends sort of down into the trunk a little bit and out into the branch a little bit. And it's this area that has the ability to have an increased concentration of phenols, which is this naturally occurring pesticide. And so if you're pruning it at the right place, you're going to stimulate all this and also help to minimize future decay. So the branch protection zone, this BPZ, is a zone of chemical and physical properties that retard the spread of decay into the trunk. Also can help retard the progression of insect and borer damage. So also one of the things that we have to consider is that we should know by now, or we're getting the feeling by now, that codominance or bifurcation, or where the main trunk splits off and there is no branch collar, that these areas are sort of a special circumstance. They do not compartmentalize well at all. So as a product of poor compartmentalization, we still want to try to minimize the potential for decay. So we're going to prune them in a special way, but we need to remember that when we are trying to handle codominance, it could lead to some significant decay. So put some thought into how and when you're going to take care of that. Codominant stems often lack a branch bark ridge. Codominant stems often contain included bark, which further weakens the connection. So, we talked about how, codominants like this, if we were to make the cut down here and look on top of it, we would see two complete rings of bark. So there is no real connection until you get to that point, which the bifurcation actually began. So here's our look back at the branch bark ridge. So here's this ridge. Here's the branch collar. And so this ridge is sort of gives you an indication of when and how deeply this branch is rooted. Because remember, we have this trunk, this column, and we have this twig coming off of it, or this branch that comes off of it. And each one of those is independent of the other. Remember, a branch is sort of functionally independent of the trunk. So you have a little bit of growth every year, this secondary growth of getting larger on the branch, and secondary growth happening in the trunk. So it's going to get a little larger every year, because a new tree grows on the outside of the last year's tree over and over and over again. So which means, like, if you look back in time, maybe that branch was this big in diameter and now it's this big in diameter. So you can visualize sort of a cone occurring inside of the tree here. Maybe I can draw it out for you. So this branch bark ridge, if we were to look back in time, sort of comes down like this. And we look on the bottom side of the branch, and it's going to kind of do like this. And so you get this sort of cone shape inside of here that begins to occur. And so there's an overlap of branch and trunk material. So if I were to prune out here, see where it says cut here. So if I were to cut here, my potential for decay back into the trunk is just going to be the limb wood, not the trunk wood, because I didn't cut any trunk tissue. I just cut limb tissue out here. So over time, you might get this little pocket of decay that forms inside of here that was the limb wood. But if you come back this branch bark ridge to here, this is the diameter, or if we look over on this one, sort of come back to here. If we were to look at this, if we were to draw a line above that and below that, that would have been, what do we have here? So something about like this. So this is about the diameter that the main trunk was when this branch started to grow. So if you trace this back in time to where in that branch bark ridge ends, that's about the diameter the tree was when the branch first started to grow out. So it's important to make this cut out here where you're just cutting limb wood, no cutting the trunk wood. So if you made this flush cut right through here where you're cutting into the branch collar, now you're cutting trunk wood and limb tissue. So as you do that, now your potential for decay becomes the entire trunk at the time the cut was made. So in the future, as this thing grows in diameter, this is all going to be that fourth wall material and the vascular tissue that occurs after that coated fourth wall. So the potential of decay is going to be everything from the size the tree was the day you cut it inward towards the middle back in time. So it's you can see how that's a huge difference between a little pocket of decay and a huge column of decay. So this is a strong branch union. There's no inclusion here, very well-defined branch collar. This one would be bifurcated. So we have the codominance, and if we look back down in time, you see this sort of seam. If we were to even cut it here and look down on top of it, we would still see two separate trees. So there is no physical connection from this point upward. Which can lead to things like this, which is a failure. So if we were to look closely at this, you can see this sort of light colored tissue in the reaction wood or the fourth wall of the coated model. So as it sort of moved and separated a little bit, it cracks time over time. And so you can get a little decay that starts on the surface inside of the bifurcation. As this reaction tissue grows, though, it's going to push on each other, and it can actually increase the risk of failure because of that. So now we're going to talk about the two different types of cuts. I still don't see any questions up there, so feel free to ask questions during any of this if you don't understand it, and I'll try to help walk you through it before we get too far into other sections. So now we're going to talk about the thinning cut. So the preferred place to prune is back to the parent branch or the trunk. So we're taking off the smaller piece, just like we just looked at it. That pruning example we had here, this is going to be a thinning cut because we're removing something that is small relative to the parent that it's attached to. So those would be thinning cuts. And it doesn't have to be all the way back to the trunk. You can make thinning cuts anywhere along a large branch, a large leader. So any of those could be, like in this picture, if I were to prune this branch back to this branch, this one's still obviously much smaller than its parent. So that's going to continue to be a thinning cut. They should be made just to the outside of the branch collar. Pruning outside of the branch collar closely will simulate where branches are naturally shed. So if the branch were to die off because it's unproductive or something, it's going to die back to that branch collar. Cut should be very smooth and not jagged. When I first started in this industry 30-something years ago, we used these really rough, only one side of the tooth was sharpened, these Fano saw blades, and you'd finish a cut and they look pretty darn jagged. But today's modern technology, these nice Japanese blades that we can use now that cut on both sides of the tooth make for a super smooth finished cut. So the smoother that is, the better it is for the tree because it's going to produce a better reaction. So here's some other examples of some thinning cuts. This is a live oak in my front yard that suffered some serious freeze damage. So I wanted to abuse it a little bit before we cut it down, use it for some demonstration. But here we have a branch that has a very tight branch attachment compared to this one that has a pretty U shape to it. It's nice and open. So I'd want to take off this one. This one's a little more open, especially when compared to this one. So the crowding. So this is something I would like to remove. We also want to remove crossing branches, eliminate it early in the tree's life. So here you can see a branch that comes straight off and another one that goes straight up. So the pruning cuts that are going to result here are going to be pretty small pruning cuts. So these are going to close much better. They're going to close quickly. The limit of decay is going to be very small because you're going to have this very small pocket going back into the trunk. Don't wait for years and years for this to become a structural problem. Go ahead and take care of it. Good use of the thinning cut. Unlike reduction cuts, thinning cuts will target the branch collar. So again, my branch collar here is going to be way down here, but I want to do the best that I can. So the best that I can do without injuring anywhere else is about right here. So all of this is included. Over time, the parent will eventually grow and absorb this, and it'll be caught inside of the wood at some point. But that's really the best I could do given the circumstances. Here's the one that was the crossing and rubbing branch. Notice I was able to get to most of the branch collar here, even though the branch collars, again, this was a very tight branch angle. So the branch collar would have been more like this, but I really didn't want it to make a bigger cut, because if you start cutting at these weird angles, you're going to get something like that instead of something like that. So these small circles are a little easier to close up. So I wanted to show you some reality, because textbook pruning is never like the real world. So just trying to give you some examples of what it would look like out in the real world. So reduction cuts. So reduction cut is kind of the opposite of the thinning cut. So in the reduction cut, we're going to take off the larger material and we're going to cut it back to something smaller. So the branch protection zone does not work as well when you're cutting it on that side as it does on the thinning cut. It will still work, because we're going to stimulate it, because we'll look at it in a minute. It's sort of reflexive around that branch bark ridge. So we're still going to use that branch protection zone. It just won't compartmentalize quite as well as the other method. The ability of the tree to compartmentalize the wound is a function of the size of the cut, the vigor and the species of the tree, and the climate. So young trees are going to grow much more aggressively. So try to take care of these reduction cuts when the tree is much younger, and in a time when the tree is still growing vigorously. And the younger that you make these cuts, the smaller the diameter is going to be. So the smaller the diameter, the better it's going to respond. It's important to consider the ability of the remaining branch to sustain itself and assume apical dominance. Because remember, during the biology section, that apical meristem out at the tip of that branch or the top of the tree, it produces that auxin, that hormone that comes back downstream and tells the rest of the branch, hey, don't grow so much, I'm in charge, relax. So if you make these reduction cuts, what are you doing? You're taking off that apical meristem. And so by doing that, you're going to tell the tree, hey, what I'm cutting back to needs to become dominant. So if I'm making this cut late in the season or in the winter or super early spring before we have leaf out, I might have the chance to actually send a signal to the tree to say, hey, what I've cut back to is supposed to take over apical dominance, and hopefully it'll kick in. However, if it doesn't, it's not going to establish apical dominance for the whole next growing season. So, if you do this a reduction cut, and then you get this flush of growth all down the trunk and stuff like that, it was either you pruned off too much or you pruned it during a part of the season where it's not going to be able to signal another branch to become apically dominant. So timing is important. So here's some examples of reduction cuts. Notice that I'm taking off the apical meristem here. I'm cutting back to something that is large enough that it can become apically dominant. I've also not taken off very much of the entire photosynthetic capacity of the branch. Again, this tree's got a lot of freeze damage, so it's not very thick to begin with, and this branch would probably have died back to where I pruned it anyway. But so I've taken, and this is a really small cut. Notice I'm doing it with hand pruners. So this type of reduction cut is not going to be negatively impactful to the tree's health when compared to making reduction cuts that are on wood like this big around, and I'm having to cut back to a branch that's this big around. So be sure to prune back to subordinate the branch that can assume apical control. We'll talk a little about branch subordination in a minute, especially as it comes to codominance. So again, here is the reduction cut. So we're taking off the larger part, we're cutting back to something smaller. Here's that branch bark ridge that we talked about a while ago. That branch protection zone is kind of going to be in this area. So we want to have a compromise here between You don't want to necessarily follow the exact angle here, but maybe 90 degrees from it. So you've got that and that. So try to minimize it. So remember, the smaller the wound you can make, the better the tree can close it or wall it off. So the greater this angle, the closer to that branch bark ridge angle that you get, the more ovate your cut's going to become. It's going to become very, very large when you could have had one this big, changing the angle of the pruning cut a little bit. So thinning cuts, again, you're going to cut back to something that's larger. You're going to cut at the branch, just to the outside of the branch collar, so that you're only cutting limb tissue. We often get asked the question, well, is it better to accidentally cut into the branch bark collar or to cut it too long? And the answer is, when I studied with Dr. Shigo would pound his fist, and he was a huge guy. So if you haven't read any of Dr. Alex Shigo's books, I strongly recommend that you get either New Tree Biology or Touch Trees, one of those, or both of them, and read through it. He's kind of the godfather of our industry. He got us going on the right path. But he would just get super upset when people would ask that question, and he would pound his giant, I mean, his hand was like 3 times the size of mine. He'd pound on the desk. You do it the right way. So you get as close as you can to this branch collar. Don't intentionally leave a stub unless not doing so would injure the parent stem. So heading cuts, though, this involves cutting limbs to a stub, a bud, or lateral branch not large enough to assume apical dominance. So I'm going to cut off something this big and cut it back to something like that. That's going to be a heading cut. Heading cuts are also like a topping cut. So topping cuts, all topping cuts are heading cuts, but not all heading cuts are topping cuts, if that makes sense. We often use heading cuts to stimulate that additional growth, because remember, about taking off apical dominance, the tree is going to bush out, or the shrub is going to bush out. So heading cuts would be something more typically used in shrubs. It can be used in trees, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but mainly it would be used in shrubs. Early intervention can help prevent problematic decay issues. So we're gonna pretend like this was storm damage over here, and this had nothing to do with poor pruning, but in reality, some of this was pretty poor pruning. So you can see this tree was topped in the past. You can see the small growth that comes off of this massive growth. Same thing here, and out these branches. And you can see on the inside of the tree how hollow it is. It's because they didn't use collar cuts. These were all heading cuts. So they pruned trunk wood and limb tissue. So the decay was the possible amount of decay is the column of wood that was there at the time that these heading cuts were made. And so the sound wood is everything that grew about after that. So you can see there's a fairly thin wall of sound wood inside of this tree. So one, you want to avoid those heading cuts. And even when it's a proper pruning cut, you want to prune it when it's a lot smaller. So here, we're not sure what happened here, but just as an example, maybe this tree and this street have been getting along for a long time, but we knew that there were going to be UPS trucks driving down the street at some point. And so we would begin to prune or elevate this plant to establish permanent branch habit much younger in its life, so that we didn't have to make these giant hardwood exposing cuts at this point. So avoid these large cuts. Everybody should have a response prepared about topping. We know that topping is bad inherently, but here's the top 8 reasons why not to top. 1, you're taking off all those energy reserves in that wood tissue. Remember, it's stored all those starches in there, so you're taking all that off. And in this case, you're taking off all of the photosynthetic capacity, so it's going to have to regrow that. So the starches that are stored in this remaining wood is going to have to be used to try to establish a new canopy. You've taken off all the auxin producing meristems in here, so that there's going to be a major imbalance in hormones, which initiates this sort of shock. You've sort of opened the tree up to insect and diseases because you've taken these are all sort of improper heading cuts. So you've not stimulated any of the branch protection zones here. So things are going to be able to get in and work to try to get to the remaining starch reserves in this tree. The growth that happens afterwards is going to be very rapid, and it's only going to be attached by that current year's growth ring. So remember, branches sort of develop in this pocket going back into the trunk. Well, sucker growth is just going to be attached on that 1 year's worth of lawn tissue. Not a very strong attachment for something that's going to grow very vigorously, get very long, get big in diameter in a hurry, because it's trying to reestablish its photosynthetic capacity. You're also going to have the possibility of, it was killed from topping it. It's not going to last very long. That's not a very natural looking appearance. This looks like a disaster area, and it's almost like paying for a removal twice. If you had to do all this, you should have just taken it out, because you're just going to be taking it out the next year, or you're going to be spending so much in maintenance because of the bushy growth that you could have easily have removed it. So the actual mechanics of the pruning cut, this is our final objective. We want a very smooth final cut. We don't want a lot of tearing out here. So notice this sort of discolored area in the lighter area. The lighter area is the xylem tissue, the darker area is the phloem tissue, and then just to the outside of that is the bark tissue and the bark cambium. So as much of that as we can have intact, because that's where that wall 4 develops from. It's not going to develop from deeper in the tissue. It's going to develop right there in the current year's vascular cambium. So the more intact that is, the better little donut we're going to get left at the end. So how do we do this without tearing this up? So steps 1, 2, and 3 here. We're going to make an undercut some distance out from the trunk. So here's our first cut. This is the undercut. Step 2, make a top cut slightly further out on the limb. So you want some distance between here and here. The depth of this cut and the depth of this cut should be very similar so that they approach an overlap. Once they overlap, there's just the tissue in one direction that's holding it, and not in 2 directions. So it's you have this one direction of bonding there. And so once you get to this point, pull down on it and it'll snap here and leave you with this sort of little chair looking, which is, this is small in diameter. And so then I could with one hand and make my final cut here just outside the branch collar with my other hand, leaving me this nice pin. Here's sort of the example. Here's that upright branch of the tree. I'm going to come on the inside up here. I'm going to make a cut there, and then I'll make a cut here. As you see, here's the undercut, here's the top cut, reach up, break that off. And here I've broken off the branch and I've just let it sit there. And so you can see this piece that just snapped off. Now I can pull this out, get it out of my way. And so again, here's the resulting cut. And I know there's lots of experience that's in this class. We're taking it for the exam, and so we're sort of oversimplifying it. We're not getting into too much of the details between jump cuts and drop cuts and things like that. And we just need to understand the 3-cut principle, why we're doing it, and how it's applied to minimize the final damage to the final cut 3. So it looks like we've got a couple of questions popping up.
No, Rob, it was just me checking. You had cut out on me a couple of times, so I wanted to make sure it was me and not everybody.
I got yeah, I had something flash up, said unstable connection a couple of times, but it didn't last too long.
But you did have one question, and then I ended up having to take a call. So I told them you normally address this, but are you allowed to use pruning seal on trees? I had told them you usually address that, but I missed if you have addressed that or not.
Yeah, we'll cover it. I think it's towards the end of the
Okay.
of the slideshow, but the answer is It depends.
Awesome. We will wait patiently.
Yeah. So, if you do accidentally cut into that branch collar where you have the overlap of tissues, you might see something like this. You can see how thin that proper wall is here, and then how thick it is up at the top. Here, we've actually cut into the branch collar. And so this is not the same plant, by the way, but it's a similar reaction. So you can see that we did not get a nice donut of that wall 4 reaction from the coated model. We just sort of got these parentheses that set up. We want to avoid this happening, especially on larger cuts. On small ones, it's not going to matter too much, but on bigger cuts, like the one shown here, it would have an impact. So another thing that I might not have talked about yet, but when we prune these off, remember, pruning is a wound, and you're instantaneously wounding the tree when you cut it off. And so the tree is going to respond to this wound, and it's going to start that chemical process of developing wall 1, wall 2, then wall 3, and then eventually wall 4. That wall 1 begins to develop within about 30 seconds of when you make your cut. So when they talk about the sealing, that's not only the closure from wall 4, but the plugging of the vascular tissues in walls 1, 2, and 3. And so the better you make this, the better your walls are going to persist and not fail. Pruning cuts on large limbs. Large or heavy limbs should be removed using the 3-cut process. If you have a really large branch you're taking off, then you want to start way out at the tip and tip that thing in. Don't try to take the whole branch at once, because you don't want to do more damage out in the canopy. So start reducing the weight of that longer branch, work yourself back in, and then once you get closer to the trunk, you're still going to use this 3-cut method for your final cut, but the distances are going to change. So you're going to want to cut back to things you can hold, because you start getting into 18-inch diameter live oak, and every foot of it's going to weigh 35, 40 pounds. So it gets quite heavy. And again, you want to be able to control whatever that final cut's going to be. So even a little wedge of live oak that's only a few inches thick, but it's 12 or 13 inches in diameter, that's still going to be heavy. It's going to be hard to do with one hand. So just keep that in mind. So now we're going to talk about some structural pruning. Structural pruning is meant to establish a strong scaffold system and central leader in the tree for the future tree to grow on. You want the good branch spacing so that the branches aren't growing into one another, sort of like a Bradford pear. Everyone beats up Bradford pears. It's really not a bad tree. It's still a pear tree, so they can still live well over 100 years. If you started structural pruning when you first plant the thing, they're not going to blow up on you. They're going to continue to live for a long time, but who wants this really thin, scraggly looking Bradford pear when they're young? So no one does it, or people don't even stop to consider that you could do it. But you can structurally prune them and get them to last for many years longer than the typical 12 to 13. We normally do structural pruning. We start when the tree is fairly young. Again, we want to avoid these big giant cuts over the history of the tree. Trees that have been structurally pruned are less likely to fail and require less maintenance later on, because we're not going to have as much decay. We're going to have better branch taper and trunk taper. What are the 5 steps to structural pruning? So again, we're trying to establish what's our objective here. Remove the broken, dead, dying, diseased, or damaged branches. If you have a really young tree, like one that you just planted, that's as far as you're going to go. You're going to do step 1, boom, you're done with your 1 structural pruning. You might come back in 2 or 3 years and say, well, it looks like I've got maybe some co-dominance going, so maybe I should subordinate prune one of those so that I can establish a dominant leader. So then you might pick up number 2. Once the tree gets to be a little older, or is already a little older, and you have those branches we talked about where the Parks Department guy was hitting it with his tractor, if that's 10 feet high, then we're going to establish the lowest permanent branches at maybe 11 or 12 feet to allow for some droop at the tips to keep the whole thing up high enough where they can do maintenance under the tree. It's just one example. We'll have others. You're going to select and establish the scaffold branches. Again, you want even spacing throughout the tree. However, when the tree's younger, just because we've identified what our lowest permanent branch is doesn't mean we're going to need to prune up to that point yet. Maybe the tree still is struggling and we want it to have as much photosynthate as we can. So we're going to identify all the branches that we're going to retain under those permanent branches, and we're going to call those temporary branches because we're eventually going to prune them off, leaving the permanent branches. Here's a young tree that's been structurally pruned. Notice there's a good amount of brush under this tree. Younger trees can tolerate a little more pruning than the older trees can. We have multiple points here we have multiple tops here trying to take over. You can see how this guy's way up here, and we want to establish that apical dominance. So here we've done that. So we didn't do just a ton of subordination pruning. We actually took it all the way back to the trunk, but we have established a strong central leader. We've opened the canopy up a little bit. Once this sort of multiple tip thing sets up genetically in a tree, you're going to see it throughout the whole canopy, not just along the trunk. So in this picture, they've also begun to subordinate further out on these branches, hoping to give these branches better taper into the future. So select the leader or the primary terminal shoot. Select those permanent branches. Again, these will be left in place, and they often are the basis on which you form the scaffold network of the tree. Scaffold branches are the permanent or structural branches of a tree. They should be well spaced so that as they grow in diameter, I don't want to have two coming off the trunk like this a few inches apart, because this one's, if it's a water oak, this one's going to become 2 or 3 feet in diameter, and this one's going to be 2 or 3 feet in diameter. So they're going to squish together and lead to branch failure. So we want to have good spacing, take into consideration the species. So the permanent branch spacing on a Japanese maple is going to be much different than the permanent branch spacing on that water oak or willow oak. Some other reasons to prune: maybe you should just put the right tree in the right place. So here we have a tree that remains relatively small for its life. It's a vase shape, so it's not really ever going to cover up this sign or get into the sidewalk or out into the street. So this is kind of the right tree in the right place here. So maybe no structural pruning needs to be done. Consider the species. Here we have one that's a little more the street into the parking areas and pedestrian areas. So this one you'll have to put a little more thought into when and how to set up the lowest permanent branch and the scaffold pruning. The young ones, factors to think about might be the site, the time of year, the species of the tree, growth of pruning than young trees. And if you think about these large mature trees, the branches are going to be much bigger in diameter. So inherently, you're going to have bigger cuts to the wall for closure, or power line clearance, or some roadway clearance. By the time they get to be mature, you're really not going to be you should have already established permanent branching structure and that sort of thing. Again, never remove more than 25% of a tree's leaf bearing capacity. In the city of Atlanta, I think this might even be down to 20%. You can't remove more than 20% of the leaf bearing capacity of a tree in Atlanta. So make sure you also know your ordinances. But for this exam, here we have 25% of the leaf bearing capacity. Limit pruning to the removal of dead branches, structural defects, and utility clearance, again, on the mature tree. So here's a mature tree that's been pruned. You see very little that's been, you see very little difference between these two. There is some difference. They've opened it up a little bit, but in general, they didn't take out a whole lot. Just look for some major defects and took those out. Maybe did a little roof and building clearance over the house here. So some other types of pruning you will find in the newest iteration of your manual. You'll find something called natural pruning. It's a much more inclusive term, but you will still hear about crown cleaning and crown thinning and some of these other methods that we're going to talk about. Crown cleaning is the selective removal of water sprouts, sort of dead, dying, diseased, crossing, and hazardous branches from a tree. This would be sort of maintenance. This is what you're going to go after to keep the tree sort of open. A lot of our genetically improved trees that we have in our landscapes are probably a little more dense than the naturally occurring varieties would be. So you want to keep them open to reduce possibility of disease and things like that. And the branches will rub on each other. So you want to prune them so that you don't have that type of impact. Crown thinning includes crown cleaning, as well as a selective removal of branches to increase light penetration, air movement through the crown, and to reduce weight. So again, thinning, you're not really changing the overall size of the tree, you're just changing sort of the density of the canopy. Crown raising, this removes the lower branches of a tree in order to provide clearance for buildings, signs, vehicles, and pedestrians. Again, natural pruning speaks more to the morphology, or what's the best way to prune the tree, whereas these older definitions such as crown raising and thinning and all that sort of stuff, you know, we used to say, you know, raise crown to 10 feet, something like that. But raising it to 10 feet might do more harm than good, or raising it to 12 feet might make for a better cut or better spacing in the scaffold branching. So natural pruning takes into account these objectives, plus it adds that the morphology and the morphology of how it grows and the size of the branches in ratio to the trunk, so that it's a healthier form of pruning. It allows the arborist to make more arboriculturally sound decisions, whereas these older definitions were pretty useful for property management companies who had some strict definition of how to prune. Vista pruning is the selective removal or reduction of scaffold limbs to allow for a specific view. So again, we go back to standing on our mountain home's deck, looking out into trying to see our vista. So some people would reduce or top the tree all the way down to the level of the patio so that you're looking over it and you get your grand view. But vista pruning might also be pruning up from a little bit so that you're looking under the tree canopy, or it might just be crown thinning enough to where you get sort of an interesting view of the mountains in the background. So vista pruning vista pruning done properly does always account for how the branches are formed and how you're going to impact the tree from a health perspective. Crown reduction is used to reduce the size of the tree or branch compared to what's being left. So you want to have something that's at least 1/3 the diameter. So if you have this branch like this and this branch that comes off the side, you want to prune back to something that can handle that apical dominance. Crown restoration is used to improve structure and appearance. This is usually done over several years. Here in Central Texas, a few years back, we had this major ice storm, and we had lots of dieback, vascular disruption, and stuff like that. So we've had to, over time, we've had to prune off the dead wood, and that to restore it back to a living crown that's going to function properly. That would be crown restoration. Utility pruning is the pruning around and near utility facilities with the objective of maintaining a safe and reliable utility service. So utility pruning is usually very well defined in the contracts. Here's sort of an example of a branch that was pruned off way back here. Notice these fungi come all the way back to the branch protection zone here at the branch collar, and then you don't see it on the main trunk. So this is sort of a neat representation of how well that branch protection zone works. But you would have wanted to have made this cut to begin with. Mistletoe, again, you can either knock the mistletoe out, because where it roots into the tree, it goes 12, 14, 15 inches back towards the parent stem. So to get rid of this, we'd actually have to prune back to here to get rid of this big clump, but you can do it and it gets rid of the mistletoe. Then here's an example of crossing and rubbing branches. And again, that's going to wear down the bark and eventually erode into the cambium. And we don't want cambial damage at all. So here's some reduction cuts that maybe this is a crab apple or something like that. And you're trying to keep a very formal shape to it. So the dash lines here, which are cutting back. So the points in red here, which are taken off. So again, sort of read through these, read through your sections on pruning, and sort of understand what the ratios are as we go through here. Crown thinning to control canopy density. Again, this should be something that's done very early in the tree's life and sort of maintained over time so that you're not making these huge cuts to change canopy density. Here's some examples of utility pruning. They came through and instantaneously took a big chunk out of the middle of this to provide clearance for the power lines. This is going to lead to a serious disaster. Here we have live oaks, which we know to be giant trees, and these little 3 foot by 3 foot sidewalk cutouts. So one that's not near enough space here. That should never have been planted under all these utilities, because just going to get destroyed in pruning. So right tree, right place would have been much better here. Maybe this is a good place for a trident maple, not a live oak. And here's some more examples of permanent branch structure. So permanent branches over the street might not start till way up here. Maybe this is 15 feet, 13 feet, the height of your UPS truck. But over the side of the sidewalk, maybe 6 feet or 7 feet is going to be your lowest permanent branch. So lowest permanent branches don't have to be symmetrical all the way around the tree. It could be different over the street versus over the sidewalk. Here, just as some mower example, again, this is that tree that had the ice damage in the front yard. So I want to establish, I'm about 6 feet tall, so I want to be able to get around under this tree and do get poked in the face as few times as possible. So I'm going to actually see what 6 feet off the ground looks like. So everything from here down, this is going to be temporary branches. Since this is a residential site, everything from that point up is going to become a permanent branch. So we have removed the temporary branches, and you can see how much easier it's going to be to mow under it. Plus it improves the visibility from the house out to the street and vice versa. Here's developing over time. This is sort of here's a look, maybe some of these trees like the one you just saw in my front yard. If this were close to a street or in a cul-de-sac, in one of those center islands in a cul-de-sac, maybe all these branches are going to be temporary because none of them are over 13 feet yet. And so here we are 5 or 10 years later. We're going to begin to set up some of the scaffold branching. We're going to try to minimize, especially up here where our permanent canopy is going to begin. We're going to want to make sure that the spacing is good up here. We want to begin to shorten some of these temporary branches, make them a little less efficient at photosynthesizing so that the upper canopy can establish dominance. So we're trying to take away some of the dominance at the lower canopy when we begin this on these older 5 to 10-year-old trees. And then again, here's our mature tree. So this is supposed to be the same tree over and over and over again. So here's this branch we came across. Here's our permanent branch. So that was what we established as our lowest permanent branch. And this is sort of what grew about after that. Again, we want to make sure that we're having good branch taper in here. We're wanting to establish a single leader. Things that you want to try to avoid. These are poor pruning tactics. Lion tailing is caused by the removing of too many interlateral branches. This happens a lot where I am because these live oaks are huge spreading oak trees and people want to be able to see through them. So they start stripping out the interiors, and some of these companies will literally take off, 80% of the internal structure. Sort of pom-pom out at the end, and it's horrible to the trees. It causes all kinds of damage. Clearing too much foliage, so they strip all that out. The next year you get all these upright suckers that are growing there, which you want to avoid. Another poor practice is topping, as we know. Internodal pruning, this is another, like a heading cut, is a thinning cut that's not pruned back to a lateral. It's just, remember, if you're pruning back to a node, you're going to be pruning back to a lateral. So if you're pruning in between the two nodes, that's an internodal prune. Here's an example of that lines tailing. And you can see where there's just little pom-poms out here. The inside of the tree's wide open. They also made these flush cuts. You can tell by this kind of diamond shape that instead of the nice round shape like we would expect if you cut it at the branch collar. So this is a big giant cut, another big giant cut, and you can see some bigger cuts right through here. And then the thinning cuts they had to do to strip it all. I mean, this is just, it's horrible to have a tree like this. Again, why topping is harmful: starvation, shock, insects, disease, weak limbs, rapid new growth, tree death. It doesn't look very good, and it's expensive. Again, here's some heading cuts. They cut back to these laterals, obviously not sufficient enough to support all of this sink. Remember our concept of sink and source, where the source is the leaves. That's where the photosynthesis comes from. The rest of the plant is a sink that's going to consume energy. So if you take off all the energy consuming portions of the tree, everything you leave is a sink. And so it's going to have to call upon all the reserves in here to try to reestablish these suckers, these straight up suckers, to begin to go through the process of photosynthesis to make starches again. And it's just not going to be enough. And so these trees eventually die. So let's talk a little about pruning palms. So the fronds are large divided leaves. So from here all the way back to the trunk, that is considered one leaf or a frond. And so this frond sort of divides into what looks like smaller divisions, but really this whole thing is one leaf. You're going to remove dead fronds from the top down. So if these this palm's way over pruned, by the way, but if these palms will typically have branches that sort of fold down that are dead, and then you've got another set that might be dead, and then another set that's yellowing, and then another set that's nice and green, and then a set that's vibrant green, and then you have your spike where the new growth is coming out. So that these things are very heavy. So when you prune them from the top, like if you're above them and you're sort of taking off the dead wood, the chances you as a practitioner being hurt is greatly reduced, because all those could just slough off at once. Then you have hundreds of pounds of sharp, nasty, bug infested stuff falling all over you. Not fun. Anyone that's pruned a palm tree probably wishes they hadn't. Do not remove the live healthy fronds. And even those fronds that are beginning to turn yellow, those are storing magnesium and some other microelements. So if you can leave those that are yellowing, leave those as well, because the tree's still using those as that energy reserve and microelement reserve. By pruning those off, you're going to have to supplement the tree with those microelements to make sure that it always has enough of them. Live fronds should only be removed if they are loose or dangerous. Sever it close to the petiole base without damaging the living trunk tissue. Again, don't spike trees. Notice this guy's up here standing on spikes, pruning a tree. This is what they call a hurricane cut, where you're just pruning it all the way back to the current year's growth. You've taken off everything else. Will it survive this? Yes. Will it survive it over and over and over again? Probably not for too long. Each one of these times you stick that spike in there, you are damaging and killing those vascular bundles, because remember, they don't have they don't rely on the xylem, the accumulation of xylem tissue. Once they start shooting up, they're the same diameter from the point they come out of the ground to the top of the tree. So predetermined how much they have. So each one of those you put in there, you are taking away some of that vascular capacity of the tree that it will never get back. Some other specialty pruning techniques. This is called espalier. Espalier is kind of this two-dimensional pruning. So you're pruning it flat against a wall. You've got nice spacing. It's an artistic form of pruning that requires good training to know how to do it. Pollarding is also a specialty pruning technique used on large maturing trees that results in the development of callus at the cut ends of the branches. And we'll see some examples of that in a second. You initiate the pollarding process by making internodal cuts. So if it's not been pollarded in the past, you make these internodal cuts, and by doing so, you get this resurgent growth year after year after year, and you eventually develop this big fist or this knob down at the end of the branch. So here are some trees that have been pollarded. These trees are perfectly healthy, and this is a legitimate way of pruning if you know how to do it, and the species well, it's too hard to prune back all those little shoots to that fist every year. That's a lot of work. Why don't I just that whole fit that destroys the pollard? Because the way that these work, so these are actually London plane trees over here. These are, think about sycamores. So sycamores get to be huge. It's the largest deciduous tree in North America. So you have these giant fists that accumulate here, and that's where the starch reserves are put in order to grow next year's shoot growth. So the shoots will come about in the following year after this is done. But if you prune this off, there's no energy to go back to. So then you start using more and more of the starch reserves until you kill it. Some of these have been pollarded for over 100 years. This practice started back in the silk industry when they wanted to be able to harvest the leaves of the mulberry very close to the ground, like on ladders, to be able to feed the silkworms. So they found that they could cut these back. The trees would still live a long time. The leaves were easy to get to, all that sort of thing. And then in northern England, when they don't have as much sun as we have here in the winter time, so their growing period's a little shorter. They also figured that the cows could eat this whip-like growth on these trees. And so not only was it used to bring leaves closer to the ground, but when they did prune it back in late winter, it gave the cattle something extra to eat. Now, back to your question of wound dressing. Wound dressings are compounds applied to tree wounds or cuts for cosmetic reasons primarily. Studies have not shown any beneficial effect in wound callusing. So you're not going to stimulate the callus to do anything other than develop that wall for the coated model. In fact, what has been shown is that you take these black sealants, so that you're trapping moisture, you're increasing the heat behind it. It makes, and plus most of them are tar-based, so it's a toxin. So you've got a toxin that's going to kill some tissue, black absorb heat, sealant trap moisture. All of a sudden it begins to sound like an incubator for pathogens. And in fact, that's what it is. Is there a proper use for it? Yes, there is. So here in Central Texas, oak wilt is a big deal. We have this nitidulid beetle that drinks the sap. When it drinks the sap of an infected tree and then flies to another tree and drinks sap out of it, it can inoculate the next tree with oak wilt. So we are required here in the state of Texas to prune and paint the pruning wounds. But is there a special kind of paint? No, you don't have to use wound. Any type of paint was fine. We even have some clients that ask us to color match the bark as close as we can so the pruning paint doesn't show up. The object is just to keep the wound from weeping for about 2 or 3 weeks, which is the period that the nitidulid beetle would be attracted to the plant after pruning. So there's also some evidence that the dogwood borer is attracted to pruning wounds similar to the dulid beetle, so you could paint a dogwood wound as well to sort of retard that borer from getting in place. Pruning tools, they should be sharp, clean, sterile. All your pruners should be bypass type pruners, not the anvil type, because you don't want to crush the plant material. Timing. So growth is maximized if pruning is done just before bud swell in late winter or early spring. You also help to maximize the apical dominance when you're doing it during that period. It also allows them a full season to compartmentalize the wound so that you made. Keep in mind that flowering trees and fruit trees have their own kind of pruning schedule, and it's different from stone fruits versus citrus versus. So if you're going to prune fruit trees, read up, learn about the best time to prune them to maximize the flower, to maximize the number of fruits, and how to thin the fruits, and that sort of thing. We also have some growth regulators out there, so to help us minimize the number of times you would have to prune trees. So plant growth regulators are effective in very small quantities. They can alter plant growth and development for years. Some of these, like paclobutrazol, can have 9 to 10 years of effectiveness on very small parts. It is an anti-gibberellin. So gibberellin is what accumulates out in the apical meristem to allow it to have shoot elongation in the spring. Paclobutrazol gets in there and triggers a block and says, hey, I'm already full. There's no need to store any more gibberellin. So then that gibberellin is used elsewhere in the plant throughout the growing season, often stimulating the root system. So it's a good way to improve the effectiveness of the root system and ward against drought. It can also reduce pruning and reduce how quickly things grow back into utility lines. All right.